A single swing. That is all it took to end a queen. May 19th, 1536. A swordsman brought from France planted his feet on the scaffold at the Tower of London. He raised a blade forged specifically for this moment, and with one fluid motion, he separated Anne Boleyn's head from her body. But death did not arrive on impact. For up to 30 agonizing seconds, her brain continued to function inside the severed skull. Her eyes blinked. Her mouth opened and closed around words no one could hear. Consciousness flickered inside a head that had already left its body behind. She could see the crowd. She could feel the absence of everything below her neck. And there was nothing she could do but wait for the darkness to finally take her. This is not how history tells the story. The official version is clean. A merciful king. A swift execution. A tragic but dignified end. Every word of that narrative was carefully manufactured. Henry VIII did not simply want Anne Boleyn dead. He wanted her unmade. He wanted every trace of her influence, her voice, her very identity dissolved before the blade ever touched her skin. What happened to Anne Boleyn was not an execution. It was an erasure, engineered by the full machinery of the Tudor state. And to truly understand the horror of those final conscious seconds on the scaffold, you cannot start with the sword. You have to start with the cell, with the silence, with the weeks of calculated psychological destruction that came before. Today, we are pulling apart the exact blueprint the Tudor regime used to dismantle a queen from the inside out. Every tactic was deliberate. Every detail was designed to break her long before the crowd ever gathered. Before we step inside those walls, drop a comment below and tell me what city and country you are watching from. Take a second to subscribe and support the channel. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. On the first day of May, 1536, the sound of splintering wood echoed across the tournament grounds at Greenwich. Lances exploded against armor. Horses thundered down the tilt yard. The crowd roared with every collision. It was the annual May Day joust, and every noble family in England had gathered to watch. Anne Boleyn sat in the royal gallery beside her husband. Henry VIII watched the spectacle in silence. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the arena. Then, without a single word, the king rose from his seat. He did not glance at his wife. He did not signal to the court. He descended the wooden steps, flanked by a handful of guards, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward London. Anne stayed behind. The noise of the crowd swallowed her confusion. She did not understand what had just happened. She would not understand for another 12 hours. The machine had already been switched on, and she was the only person at Greenwich who did not know it. The next morning, Anne was called before the Privy Council. She entered a chamber filled with familiar faces. Men she had dined with, men she had helped place into positions of influence. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat at the head of the table. He did not stand when she entered. He did not offer her a seat. He simply began reading from a document. The charges were adultery, high treason, conspiracy to assassinate the king. Anne laughed. It was a sharp, instinctive sound. She believed this was political theater, a pressure tactic designed to force her into some kind of concession, a negotiation dressed up as an accusation. She had survived court politics for a decade. She assumed she could survive this. She was wrong. The guards moved in. They led her out of the chamber, down through the corridors, and onto a waiting barge. The oars cut into the Thames without a sound. No one lined the riverbanks. No courtier appeared on the docks to acknowledge her departure. In the space of a single morning, every political ally she had cultivated over 10 years had vanished. The barge carried her east, toward the pale stone walls of the Tower of London. The iron gate rose to receive her. She stepped onto the cold ground and found Sir William Kingston waiting. He was the constable of the Tower, a man built from decades of military service, with a face that revealed nothing. Anne asked the question anyone would ask. She wanted to know if she was being taken to a dungeon. Kingston told her no. She would be housed in the royal apartments, the same chambers where she had slept the night before her coronation, 3 years earlier. This was not kindness. This was the first calculated act of psychological warfare. Anne walked into the rooms and saw exactly what they wanted her to see. Tapestries on the walls, a fire crackling in the hearth, a canopied bed draped in velvet. Every surface communicated royal privilege. And behind her, the oak door locked shut with a sound that erased all of it. The contradiction between the luxury she could see and the captivity she could feel cracked something inside her. She dropped to her knees on the floor. She wept. Then the weeping turned into laughter. Wild, uncontrollable laughter that bounced off the stone walls and filled the room with a sound no one wanted to hear. Kingston stood at the threshold and watched. He listened to every word that fell from her mouth. He was not there to comfort her. He was not there to guard her. He was a living document. Every syllable Anne Boleyn spoke inside those walls would be transcribed and delivered directly to Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was the true engineer behind everything. He did not need chains. He did not need a rack or a set of iron tools. He understood something far more effective than physical pain. He understood that a human mind, placed under the right conditions of isolation and threat, will destroy itself. He seated the room with 4 women. None of them were loyal to Anne. One was her aunt, Lady Shelton, a woman who had openly resented her for years. Another was Lady Kingston, the constable's wife. These women were given a single set of instructions. Do not speak to the Queen unless she speaks first. Listen to everything. Report everything. They stood in the corners of the room like furniture. They watched Anne eat. They watched her pace. They watched her stare at the ceiling in the dead of night. And they waited for her mind to crack open. It did not take long. Anne had no contact with the outside world, no lawyer, no parchment, no ink, no way to build a defense or even understand the full scope of what was happening to her. The human brain is not designed to endure total isolation while facing execution. It leaks. It reaches for connection even when every available ear belongs to the enemy. She began to talk. She spoke to the women about old conversations at court. She mentioned Henry Norris, one of the king's closest companions. She brought up Francis Weston, a young courtier. She wondered aloud why Mark Smeaton, a musician in the royal household, had seemed so troubled in recent days. She was not confessing. She was thinking out loud. But every word was captured, transcribed, and ferried across the river to Cromwell's desk. Anne Boleyn was writing her own indictment, and she had no idea. While the Queen spiraled inside her velvet prison, Cromwell turned his attention to the men. He needed signed confessions to justify the purge, and he knew exactly where to start. Mark Smeaton was a commoner, a lute player. He had no noble bloodline to shield him from what was coming. Cromwell's agents took Smeaton to a private residence in Stepney, not to the official interrogation chambers. This operation was never meant to leave a paper trail. They bound a knotted rope around his skull. They wedged a wooden bar through the knot, and they twisted. The rope compressed against his temples with increasing force. The pressure became unbearable. His vision blurred. His skull felt like it was being split from the outside in. Smeaton held out as long as his body allowed. Then he broke. He signed a confession admitting to a sexual relationship with the Queen. It was a lie extracted through agony, and it was the first domino Cromwell needed to topple. Next came Henry Norris. Norris was not a commoner. He was the groom of the stool, one of the most intimate positions in the king's household. Henry VIII personally confronted him on the road back to London. The king offered Norris something extraordinary, a full royal pardon. All Norris had to do was confirm the affair with Anne. Norris looked at the king and refused. He said he would rather face death than destroy an innocent woman with a fabricated confession. The regime did not need his cooperation. It simply removed him from the board. Norris was arrested. Francis Weston was arrested. William Brereton was arrested. And then the final blow landed. George Boleyn was seized. He was Anne's brother, her closest remaining ally. The charge leveled against him was incest, not because there was a shred of evidence, but because the accusation itself was the weapon. If the English public believed that the Queen had committed the most revolting sin imaginable with her own blood, no one would raise a voice when the executioner stepped forward. Inside her chamber, the women dripped the information into Anne's ears with surgical precision. They told her Smeaton had been placed in irons. They told her Weston was gone. They told her about George. Each piece of news landed like a hammer blow to a wall that was already fracturing. Cromwell's architecture was functioning exactly as designed. Anne was being forced to watch her entire world collapse through a locked window, one name at a time. On May 12th, the 4 accused men were tried at Westminster Hall. The trial was a performance, not a proceeding. The indictments listed specific dates on which the alleged affairs had taken place. Several of those dates were physically impossible. On one occasion, Anne had been residing at a completely different palace. On another, she was still recovering from the birth of her daughter, Elizabeth. The jury did not weigh the evidence. The jury weighed the signature of the king. All 4 men were convicted. Their sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. 3 days later, it was Anne's turn. A raised wooden platform had been constructed inside the Great Hall at the Tower. 2,000 people packed the chamber. The air was suffocating. Anne entered wearing a dark gown, her posture straight, her face dry. She stood before 26 peers of the realm. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord High Steward. The accusations were absurd in their breadth. She had slept with 5 men. She had mocked the king's manner of dress. She had poisoned his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She had conspired to murder Henry so she could marry Norris. The charges read like the script of a political execution, because that is exactly what they were. Anne dismantled them with precision. She identified the contradictions in the timeline. She questioned how a court musician could have entered the royal bedchamber without being noticed by a single guard. Witnesses in the gallery murmured that she had made her case. Some believed she had won. But you do not win a trial when the verdict was signed before you entered the room. The peers voted guilty. The Duke of Norfolk rose. His voice wavered. He pronounced the sentence. Anne Boleyn would be burned alive at the stake or beheaded, at the sole discretion of the king. She stood still. She did not collapse. She did not beg. She told the court she was prepared to die. Her only regret was that innocent men would be executed alongside her. She was returned to her cell, and the waiting resumed. It is one thing to read a date in a textbook. It is something else entirely to sit inside the hours that make up that date. Anne spent the next 48 hours locked inside the same room, fully aware that her brother was confined in a nearby building, waiting for the same blade. She could hear the tower waking up around her, the grinding of locks, the shuffle of boots on gravel, the low murmur of a crowd growing larger beyond the walls. On the morning of May the 17th, they came for the men. Smeton, Brereton, Weston, Norris, George Boleyn. George was permitted to speak first. He stood on the scaffold, stained from previous executions. He did not proclaim his innocence. The unwritten law of the era demanded that the condemned accept the king's judgment publicly, or risk their surviving family being targeted next. He told the crowd not to place their trust in the vanity of the world. Then he knelt. He placed his neck across the block. The axe came down. The sound of a blade cutting through a human spine does not sound the way people imagine. It is a dense, wet impact, a sound that carries across open ground. The crowd erupted. Guards dragged the body away and tossed it into a cart. They called the next man forward. Inside her chamber, Anne heard everything. 5 strikes, 5 roars from the crowd. She knew the exact second her brother ceased to exist. She knew his blood was draining into the sawdust less than 300 yards from where she sat. Henry VIII had not touched her. He had not needed to. He had already annihilated everything she was. Before we move into the final hours of Anne Boleyn's life, I need to stop and speak to you directly. You are here because you refuse to accept the polished version of the past. You want the reality, regardless of how brutal it becomes. That is exactly why we created the lineage. This is our private membership community. When you join, you are not just tossing a coin into the void. You become part of the operation. You fund the research that makes these stories possible. You get early access to documentaries, a badge next to your name, and the knowledge that you are keeping this channel independent from algorithm-driven pressure. Click the Join button below this video. Step into the lineage. Help us make sure these stories never disappear. Now, back to the cell. With her brother dead and every ally either executed or silenced, the regime moved to its final objective: erasing Anne Boleyn from the historical record. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, entered her chamber. This was a man she had personally championed, a man who owed his entire career to her influence. He sat across from her and delivered the final verdict. Her marriage to Henry VIII had been declared null and void. It had never existed. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was now officially a bastard with no claim to the throne. The legal absurdity was breathtaking. If the marriage never existed, then adultery against the king was a logical impossibility. If adultery was impossible, the treason charge had no foundation. The entire legal basis for her execution had just been erased by the same government that was about to carry it out. It did not matter. The law was never the point. The paperwork was scenery. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Anne was told she would die the following morning. She requested the sacrament. She prayed through the night. She steeled herself for the sound of footsteps in the corridor at dawn. The sun rose. The footsteps came. But Kingston did not bring the guards. He brought a postponement. The execution had been delayed. Henry had made a specific request. He did not want an axe. Axes were crude instruments. They frequently required 2, 3, sometimes 4 strikes to fully sever a neck. Henry wanted a spectacle of precision. Days before the trial had even concluded, he had already sent a messenger across the English Channel. He had hired a professional swordsman from the town of Saint-Omer in northern France. The swordsman was stuck at sea. and so Anne Boleyn was dragged back from the edge. She had spent the night preparing her mind for the end. She had released her grip on the world. She had made peace with oblivion. And now she was forced to sit in the same room, in the same silence, for another full day and night, knowing that somewhere on the water between France and England, a blade was making its way toward her throat. The sky over London on the morning of May 19, 1536, offered no sun. A thick grey ceiling hung above the Thames, and fog wrapped itself around the tower like a burial cloth. The air was damp and cold, wrong for a day in late spring, as if the season itself was refusing to cooperate with what was about to happen. Inside the royal apartments, Anne Boleyn was getting dressed. Not the way a prisoner gets dressed, the way a woman preparing to deliver a final message gets dressed. Every layer she placed on her body was a word in a sentence the crowd would have to read without hearing it spoken. She selected a gown of dark gray damask. Beneath it, she pulled on a petticoat of deep crimson red. In the Catholic tradition, red was the color of martyrdom. It was the color worn by saints who were killed for their faith. In a kingdom that had torn itself away from Rome specifically to make this execution possible, the choice of red was not decorative. It was a silent accusation sewn into fabric. She placed an English gable hood over her dark hair. It framed her face in sharp geometric lines. She looked at the room one final time, the tapestries, the fireplace, the velvet bed she had slept in before her coronation and now slept in before her death. Then she turned and walked through the door. Sir William Kingston was waiting in the corridor. Armed guards formed a tight perimeter around her. Behind her, 4 ladies-in-waiting followed. The women were openly crying. Anne was not. Her face was fixed. Her steps were even and deliberate. The leather soles of her shoes ground against the gravel path as she moved toward the Tower Green, the enclosed patch of grass inside the fortress walls where the crown carried out its most private killings. Except today, it would not be private. Henry VIII had specifically ordered the gates opened. Nearly 2,000 spectators had been allowed inside the tower walls. This was not a funeral. It was not a solemn civic duty. It was a public spectacle orchestrated with the energy of a county fair. The courtyard reeked of sweat, damp wool, stale beer, and the muddy stench of the river. Vendors weaved through the packed bodies selling small pies and warm drinks. People jostled for position. They craned their necks. They talked over each other. They had come to watch a queen lose her head, and they intended to enjoy every second of it. When Anne emerged from the fog and saw the scaffold, she understood the final humiliation the state had prepared for her. Every depiction of a royal execution you have ever seen in a film shows a towering platform. The condemned stands high above the crowd, separated by height, preserved in dignity until the final stroke. That is fiction. The scaffold built on Tower Green that morning stood barely 3 feet above the ground. The pine boards were freshly cut. The structure was so low that Anne, standing on it, was at direct eye level with the front rows of the crowd. This was not a construction limitation. This was a deliberate act of degradation. At 3 feet, there was no separation between the queen and the mob. The crowd pressed against the edge of the wood. They could count the stitches in her gown. They could see the vein pulsing beneath the skin of her throat. She could hear their whispered comments. She could smell the sourness of their breath. The invisible wall that was supposed to exist between an anointed queen and the common public had been dismantled by 3 feet of missing timber. She climbed 3 shallow steps. The fresh pine groaned under her. A thick layer of coarse sawdust had been scattered across the boards to soak up what was coming. She turned and faced the crowd. 2,000 people went quiet. What came next is one of the most misunderstood moments in English history. Every textbook describes Anne Boleyn's final speech as a courageous, dignified farewell. A queen accepting her fate with grace. That reading is comfortable. It is also completely wrong. Her speech was not an act of courage. It was a hostage negotiation conducted in plain sight. While Anne stood on that scaffold, her 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was asleep in a manor house at Hunsdon, miles from London, and Tudor law contained a provision of extraordinary cruelty called the corruption of blood. If a condemned traitor used their last words to denounce the king, to protest their innocence too loudly, or to turn the crowd against the crown, the consequences did not stop at the scaffold. The state would permanently destroy their bloodline. Estates would be confiscated. Surviving family members would be cast into ruin. Children would carry the legal brand of traitor for the rest of their lives. Henry held the only card that mattered. He had the child. Anne scanned the faces in the crowd. She knew foreign ambassadors were present, recording every word for their monarchs. She knew Cromwell's informants were standing within arm's reach of the scaffold. Every syllable that left her mouth would be transcribed, analyzed, and delivered to the king before her body was cold. If she spoke the truth, if she cursed the man who had manufactured this entire nightmare, her daughter would be erased from the future of England. The mother overruled the queen. She opened her mouth. Her voice was steady and carried cleanly across the damp air. She said she had come to die according to the law, and she would say nothing against it. She did not confess to any crime. She simply acknowledged the legal process that had brought her to this point, and then she did the thing that must have burned worse than any blade. She praised the king. She called Henry VIII a merciful and good prince. She blessed the man who had executed her brother 48 hours earlier. Every word was a lie, and every word was calculated to purchase a future for her child. She traded her historical truth for her daughter's survival. The state had engineered the perfect trap. A mother, standing in sawdust, publicly thanking her own executioner so that a toddler she would never see again might have a chance at life. The speech lasted less than a minute. When it was done, she turned away from the edge. Now the ritual of preparation began. Her 4 attendants stepped onto the low platform. Their hands trembled so violently they could barely function. Anne removed her heavy ermine mantle and passed it to her aunt. Then she reached up, unpinned the gable hood, and lifted it from her head. Her dark hair fell loose against her back. She took a plain linen coif from one of the women and pulled it snug over her hair, tucking every strand beneath the fabric. Nothing could obstruct the path of the blade. The target had to be perfectly exposed. She opened a small leather purse and withdrew her remaining gold coins. She pressed them into the shaking hands of her ladies, payment for their final service. Before the executioner steps forward, I need to break the timeline for a moment. You are watching this because you want to understand history the way it actually happened, not the way it was packaged for comfort. The suffocating detail of Cromwell's psychological operation, the architecture of the scaffold, the mechanics of the final hours, none of this came from a surface-level textbook. It came from years of deep primary source research. The book on your screen right now is the foundation of everything you just heard. It contains the original letters, the exact scaffold specifications, and the raw Tudor state records that most historians leave buried. Click the View Products button. This is a masterwork of dark historical scholarship, and you need it in your collection. While you are browsing, take a look at the other curated pieces on the shelf. There are immersive artifacts waiting for you. Open the vault explore the relics, secure the knowledge. Now, back to the scaffold. Anne Boleyn knelt in the sawdust. There was no wooden block in front of her. A block was used for an axe execution, where the condemned lays their neck across a curved groove and waits for the downward strike. This was not an axe execution. Anne had to kneel upright, her back straight, her neck extended, her chin raised toward the gray sky. One of her attendants stepped forward, carrying a strip of dark linen. She wrapped the blindfold around the queen's eyes and tied it firmly at the back of her skull. The world went black. 2,000 people stopped breathing. The vendors froze mid-transaction. Even the stray dogs that had been circling the edges of the courtyard fell silent, as though the air itself had solidified. From the far corner of the scaffold, a figure emerged. He wore no hood. He carried no mask. He was not dressed in the heavy leather apron of an English headsman. He wore close-fitting black clothing, and he moved with the quiet economy of someone who had done this many times before. This was the specialist Henry VIII had imported from Saint-Omer, the man who had been delayed at sea, the man whose arrival had forced Anne to endure an additional day of waiting inside her cell after she had already made peace with death. He stepped onto the platform. He looked at the kneeling woman. His hands were empty. He turned his gaze toward his assistant, standing just below the edge of the scaffold. A silent nod. The assistant reached into a long leather case and drew out a weapon unlike anything the English crowd had seen before. A massive, double-edged continental sword, forged for a single purpose. The blade emerged into the pale morning light, and 2,000 people understood exactly what was about to happen. The swordsman moved forward across the low scaffold. His face was uncovered. No mask, no hood. He needed full peripheral vision for what he was about to do. He could see the queen kneeling in the sawdust ahead of him. Her spine was a vertical line. Her neck was bare and pale against the gray morning air. The linen coif held every strand of hair flat against her skull. There was nothing between the steel and the skin except a few feet of cold, damp space. He understood the single variable that could ruin everything. If the body anticipates the strike, the shoulders contract. The trapezius muscles pull upward. The collarbone rises. A tensed neck can deflect a blade sideways, send it grinding into the shoulder joint instead of passing cleanly through the vertebrae. A botched swing turns a clinical execution into a slaughterhouse. He could not allow her muscles to brace. He needed a distraction, something to pull her attention away from the blade for a single heartbeat. He turned his head toward his assistant, standing at the base of the wooden steps. He barked a sharp command across the platform, loud enough for every person on the scaffold to hear. He ordered the boy to bring him his sword. Anne heard the shout. The survival instinct buried deep in the human brainstem does not care about dignity or acceptance or prayer. It reacts. Her head turned slightly toward the sound. Her brain interpreted the command as a pause in the sequence. She expected someone to climb the stairs carrying a weapon. She expected a few more seconds of life. There were no more seconds. The sword was already in his hands. He had concealed the massive continental blade beneath the straw at his feet the entire time. The instant her head rotated toward the stairs, the anatomy of her neck rearranged itself exactly the way he needed. The muscles along the side of her throat stretched taut. The gap between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae widened by a fraction of a millimeter. The biological window opened. He swung. The heavy steel moved through the air in a flat, horizontal arc. Not a downward chop. Not the clumsy overhead motion of an English axeman. A lateral sweep, fast and level, powered by the rotation of his entire torso. The edge of the blade met the side of her neck and passed through it without slowing down. It split the outer layers of skin instantly. It crushed the cartilage of the larynx. It severed both carotid arteries and both jugular veins in the same microsecond. Blood pressure to the brain dropped to 0 before the nerve endings had time to register pain. The steel found the spine and slid precisely between the third and fourth vertebrae, shearing through the spinal cord like a wire through wet clay. It exited through the opposite side of the throat and continued into open air. The connection between mind and body was severed permanently. The head separated and fell forward. It struck the pine boards with a heavy, wet sound and sent a spray of red-stained sawdust into the cold air. The body remained upright for a fraction of a second, balanced on its knees by residual muscle tension, and then collapsed backward onto the wood. Blood erupted from the open neck in rhythmic arterial pulses, pooling across the boards, dripping through the gaps in the pine, and soaking into the gravel underneath. The mechanical act of execution was complete. The biological nightmare was not. Modern neuroscience confirms what the witnesses on Tower Green saw with their own eyes that morning. The human brain does not die the moment it is separated from the body. The neurons inside the skull still hold a residual charge of oxygen and adenosine triphosphate. There is no blood flow to replenish the supply, but the existing reserves are enough. The brain remains conscious. It remains aware. It continues to process sensory input for up to 30 seconds after decapitation. 30 seconds. The swordsman stepped across the spreading pool of blood. He crouched down. He grabbed the linen coif, and the dark hair bunched beneath it. He lifted the severed head high above the scaffold and turned it toward the crowd. 2,000 people did not cheer. The reaction was something far more primal. A wave of physical revulsion rolled through the courtyard like a shock wave. Men in the front rows doubled over and vomited onto the cobblestones at their feet. Women collapsed against the fortress walls. Several spectators turned away entirely and shoved through the crowd toward the gates. They were looking at the face of their queen, and the face was looking back. Anne Boleyn's eyes were wide open. The pupils were fully dilated, black circles consuming the iris. The eyes were not still. They moved. They darted left and right, with rapid, erratic focus. They tracked the hand of the executioner gripping the fabric above her forehead. They swept across the wall of horrified faces pressed against the edge of the scaffold. Her mouth was open. The jaw worked up and down. The lips pressed together, parted, pressed together again in a continuous, desperate rhythm. She was trying to speak. She was trying to finish the prayer that the blade had interrupted. But there was no air moving across her vocal cords. There were no vocal cords at all. The sounds existed only inside the sealed chamber of her skull. She could feel the cold air against the raw tissue of her exposed brainstem. She could see the gray sky above London. She could see the blood on the boards below. She was fully aware that she was no longer attached to her own body. She was conscious, and there was absolutely nothing in the architecture of human biology that could rescue her from the experience. The oxygen faded. The neurons fired slower. The frantic darting of her eyes decelerated into a sluggish drift. The pupils lost their focus. The lips stopped moving. The muscles of the face released their final tension and went slack. The residual electrical activity in the cortex flickered once and extinguished. Anne Boleyn was dead. The swordsman released his grip. The head dropped back into the bloody sawdust. He reached for a rag tucked into his belt and wiped the gore from the edge of his continental blade with the care of a craftsman cleaning a prized tool. He collected a heavy leather purse filled with gold coins from the constable of the tower. He walked down the 3 short steps. crossed the courtyard without looking back, and left England the following morning. His job was finished. He had no further interest in the aftermath. The state had what it wanted. Henry VIII had his spectacle. The royal officials on the Tower Green folded their papers, sealed their ink, and filed out through the gates to begin drafting their reports for the king. They left the body on the stage. The four ladies-in-waiting were the last human beings standing on the scaffold. Their gowns were soaked in blood that had seeped through the floorboards and pooled beneath the platform. Their hands shook so violently they could barely coordinate their movements. But no one else was coming. No priest, no royal official, no undertaker. The responsibility of handling the mutilated remains of the Queen of England had been left to four traumatized women, standing in a puddle of arterial blood. They stepped forward. They knelt beside the body. They took a square of white linen and wrapped the severed head, covering the open eyes and the still mouth. They removed the gray damask gown from the torso. They wrapped the bleeding body in a plain white sheet, pulling the fabric tight to contain the blood that was still draining from the neck. And then they discovered something that reveals more about the Tudor regime than any speech or trial transcript ever could. The Crown had spent an enormous sum of gold to import a specialist executioner from France. The Crown had commissioned carpenters to design and build a custom scaffold engineered for maximum psychological degradation. The Crown had organized a curated audience of 2,000. The Crown had spent weeks orchestrating a sophisticated campaign of surveillance, legal theater, and mental destruction. The Crown had not ordered a coffin. No box had been prepared. No burial vessel had been arranged. Whether this was a bureaucratic failure or the final calculated insult in a long sequence of calculated insults is something historians still argue about. The result was the same. The body of the Queen of England had nowhere to go. A low-ranking guard stationed at the Tower, moved by something that might have been pity or might simply have been the discomfort of watching four women sob over a headless corpse, walked into the nearby armory. He searched through the dark storage rooms. In a back corner, he found an old elm-wood chest. It was a narrow rectangular box originally built to store longbow arrows and spare staves. He dragged it out into the courtyard and set it beside the scaffold. The chest was too short for an adult human body. The women lifted the wrapped torso and lowered it into the box. They had to force the legs to bend at the knees, pressing the limbs down against the rigid resistance of a body that had not yet fully lost its warmth. They picked up the wrapped head and placed it inside the chest next to the folded torso. They forced the wooden lid down and secured it shut. They dragged the heavy box across the gravel path toward the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small stone church built inside the fortress walls. There was no procession, no candles, no choir, no incense, no seal bearing the royal crest to mark the wood as the resting place of an anointed queen. The stone flags near the altar were pulled up. A shallow hole was scraped into the loose dirt beneath the floor. The arrow chest was dropped into the earth. It landed beside another unmarked grave, freshly dug just 2 days earlier. It was the grave of George Boleyn. Brother and sister, both murdered by the same machine, buried side by side in storage containers beneath a church floor. The dirt was shoveled back. The stones were replaced. The Queen of England was interred in an arrow box like discarded equipment. Miles away, in the manicured gardens of his palace, Henry VIII was waiting. A low, heavy boom rolled down the surface of the River Thames. The signal cannon had fired from the tower, the auditory confirmation that the French blade had completed its work. The king did not bow his head. He did not close his eyes. He did not murmur a prayer for the woman he had reshaped an entire civilization to marry. He smiled. He was not wearing black. He had dressed himself that morning in bright yellow silk. He called for his royal barge. He traveled downriver. He walked into the house where Jane Seymour had been waiting. The following morning, May 20th, 1536, they were formally betrothed. 11 days later, they were married in a private ceremony at the Palace of Whitehall. The sawdust on Tower Green had not yet been fully swept. The new queen was already wearing the jewels of the old one. The machinery of the Tudor state did not pause to reflect. It stepped over the corpse and kept moving. But the execution was only the first phase. Thomas Cromwell launched the second phase immediately, a nationwide campaign of erasure. The Romans had a term for it: Damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The objective was not merely to kill Anne Boleyn, it was to make it so that Anne Boleyn had never existed at all. Orders were dispatched to every royal residence in England. At Hampton Court Palace, stonemasons climbed scaffolding with iron chisels and heavy hammers. They attacked the ornamental carvings in the Great Watching Chamber, smashing apart the intertwined letters H and A that Henry had commissioned in celebration of their marriage just 3 years earlier. They hammered until nothing remained but ragged scars in the stone. Painters covered the white falcon emblems on the wooden screens. Carpenters tore down intricately carved oak panels bearing her initials and fed the wood to the fireplaces. The purge extended beyond the palaces. Royal guards entered the private homes of courtiers across the country. They confiscated portraits. They seized miniatures. They dragged painted canvases into the streets and burned them. Owning an image of Anne Boleyn became an act of treason. The state demanded that the population forget what she looked like. Her name was attacked with iron pen knives in the official royal ledgers. The ink was scraped from the vellum until only blank wounds remained in the pages. Henry VIII was constructing an alternate history. His second wife was to be remembered as nothing more than a brief episode of national madness, a disease that England had cured by cutting off its head. And for decades, it worked. Anne Boleyn became a ghost, a name whispered in shadows, a warning told to ambitious women in dark rooms: the headless traitor, the discarded queen. But Henry's grand architecture of control contained a single catastrophic flaw, one that no amount of chisels or fire could fix. He was obsessed with sons. He had broken England away from the authority of the Pope because he needed a male heir. He had destroyed Anne Boleyn because she had failed to give him one. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally delivered the prize: a boy, Edward. Henry felt the cosmos had validated every decision he had ever made. The male dynasty was secured. The game of blood was won. The cosmos was not finished playing. Henry VIII died in January 1547. His bloated, ulcerated body was lowered into a vault at Windsor. His precious son Edward took the throne at 9 years old. The boy was intelligent, but physically fragile. He ruled for 6 years before tuberculosis consumed his lungs. He died coughing blood at the age of 15. The invincible male Tudor line shattered like glass on stone. The crown passed to Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman Anne Boleyn had displaced. Mary burned hundreds of Protestants alive and earned the name Bloody Mary from a terrified nation. She despised the memory of Anne with a hatred rooted in religion and personal trauma. But Mary's body betrayed her ambitions. Her abdomen swelled with tumors that her physicians initially mistook for pregnancy. She died in November 1558 without producing an heir. The Tudor dynasty had exhausted its options. The sons were dead. The Catholic daughter was dead. The lords of the realm turned to the one figure they had spent 2 decades ignoring. the bastardized, disinherited, politically invisible daughter of the headless queen. In November 1558, Elizabeth Tudor entered London on horseback. A crown sat on her head. The 2-year-old girl who had been used as a psychological weapon against her mother on the scaffold was now the undisputed ruler of England. Elizabeth never spoke her mother's name in public. She understood the lethal politics of invoking a condemned traitor. She constructed her own mythology instead. The Virgin Queen, married to the nation, untouchable. She smashed the Spanish Armada. She expanded English power across the globe. She presided over a golden age of literature, exploration, and military dominance. She ruled for 45 years. She became the most consequential monarch in the history of the English-speaking world. But the public silence was a mask. Beneath it, the loyalty was absolute and permanent. When Elizabeth died in March 1603, her closest attendants prepared her body for the funeral. They moved to remove a ring she had worn on her finger for decades without explanation. It was a thick gold band set with a flat ruby and a panel of white mother-of-pearl. Historians call it the checkers ring. The women pressed a hidden mechanism on the side of the band. The mother-of-pearl face clicked open on a tiny hinge. It was a locket. Inside the miniature gold chamber were 2 enamel portraits, painted with a level of detail that could only have been commissioned at extraordinary expense. One portrait was Elizabeth herself. The other was a woman in a French hood and a dark gown, Anne Boleyn. For 45 years, the most powerful ruler on earth had carried the face of her murdered mother on her hand. Every treaty she signed, every death warrant she sealed, every fleet she launched across the ocean, every rebellion she crushed within her borders. The hidden portrait of the woman from the scaffold was pressed against the parchment every single time. Henry VIII deployed the full apparatus of the English state to erase his second wife from existence. He hammered her name out of the stone. He burned her face from every canvas. He shoved her broken body into an unmarked hole beneath a church floor and sealed it with rock. He died in 1547, believing he had won the war against her memory. He lost. The blood that soaked into the sawdust on Tower Green did not disappear. It survived the blade. It grew into an iron dynasty that outlasted every plan he ever made. The son he destroyed a queen to produce was dead before his 16th birthday. The woman he beheaded raised the ruler who built the modern world. History does not belong to the men who hold the swords. It belongs to the bloodlines that outlive the cut. Thank you for staying with this investigation until the very end. If this changed how you understand the past, take a second to subscribe, drop a like on this video, and send it to someone who deserves to see the real history behind the myth. You just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate dark history channel on YouTube. The screen in front of you right now is showing your next target. Click it. Watch it immediately. The descent continues.